Welcome to Behind the Retouching. My name is John Ross from the Art of Retouching Studio. This image was commissioned to me by Advanced Photoshop magazine. And in this video, I'd like to take you through some of the behind the scenes of what went into creating this image, some of the conversations that went on behind the scenes, to show you how I ultimately came to this as the final image. Now, obviously, to get started, there was nothing. Basically, all they told me was that they wanted some more basic retouching techniques combined with more advanced compositing techniques, as well as more creative elements. So what I did was I collected 50 samples for them, and I let the editor choose whichever image she wanted as the base. And from that, she chose this image here. And nothing is ever that easy because she had chosen an image that was shaped as a landscape, and what she needed was something that was more of a portrait, simply meaning she wanted the entire figure. Before I even did anything for the magazine article, I had to go through quite a bit of retouching on the front end to turn this image that went from her head to her pelvis and actually do an entire full figure image out of what I had as what was effectively outtakes and extra pieces. And they all had to be composited together to do this before anything could even begin to happen for the magazine. So what I had done was I had taken this base image. Now this image as it stands was actually taken on a 36 megapixel camera. And because this is a simple magazine, I could have scaled it down. However, because they may have wanted to zoom in or otherwise crop it, I didn't want to lose any of the extra detail on the front end. So I left this part of the image as a full 36 megapixel image. However, what I did need to do was go back through all of my archives and find pieces that I could put together to make this image look like it was originally shot as a full figure. So in order to do that, I went back to this as a base image. Notice I even had to rotate it a little bit. But after I had done that, now we have an image that is a full figure with the upper torso placed over the top of it. The general problem was this: we were missing hands and arms. So we're missing a hand over here and an arm over here. So what I needed to do was, once again, go back through the archives and pull up more pieces that I could composite together. So I composited this hand right here and this arm right here. Just to quickly show you, this is what the hand image was that I dropped in, and this is what the arm image was that I needed to drop in. So once I combined them together, I had basically the image that I needed with a little bit of masking, and this is what the final core image looked like. And I needed to do this before I did anything else for the magazine. So now, if you actually notice these individual layers, you will see that they have this funny icon attached to the thumbnail. And simply, this means that each and every one of these is a smart object. I always work with smart objects. And in this case, it allows me to go back to the raw file. So even though what you're looking at here on screen is a nicely composited image, the reality of it is I created a mask. I was going back and forth between the layers and adjusting colors and any other thing that really needed to happen in order to blend all of these different pieces together. Now, because of the large scope of this video, I have many other things to show you, and I don't have the time in order to go back and show you how I handled each and every one of these little individual pieces. However, suffice it to say, I simply took each of these different images, put them into a single group folder. I named it back. I did some basic cloning to the image, which simply filled in the tops, bottoms, and anything else that needed to be done. What I want to show you is from the base image, because it was for a magazine, I needed to clone out some of these questionable areas, as well as excessive wrinkles as well. And that happened down here. And in order to achieve that, I used a variety of different techniques. Mostly it was a simple healing brush, and I went in and I cloned out some of these excess wrinkles. Now, generally speaking, I wouldn't have even bothered. I would have just left them in because wrinkles often don't bother me. However, it was specifically called out by the magazine's editor, so I took the time to take them out. So now for this base image, I did a couple other things. I did a little curve layer along her breast area. I did some more work in the breasts, and then I adjusted her eye as well. And I'll just zoom in to show you the eye. Nothing really crazy, but it's simply a matter of paying attention to the details, and whenever you can, if you don't have a catch light, adding the catch light makes a huge difference to the image. So simply I did that, fixed the eyebrows a little bit, and this is what I consider the base image. I took this image, I cut out a silhouette, I threw in a background, I sent it back to the editor, who then came back to me and said, yeah, not very interesting. So even though I liked it, the editor did not, so that meant I needed to do a little bit more work, but I wasn't quite sure what they wanted, so I simply asked. I said, could you be more specific on what you want? If you give me something, I will give you a polished image back. So when I asked that question, this is the image that was sent back to me by the editor. And while I have done many composites in the past, and I have done some of these more crazy things, I really had to take myself out of my comfort zone and put myself into what the task needed. And in this case, what was really wanted was the normal retouching of a full figure, an abstract background, which was otherwise a celestial sky, and then they wanted some vector elements. They had wanted some shapes, some triangles, some circles, things along those lines. So I really had to take myself out of what I knew and put myself into what they wanted. Now, when I first saw this sample, this was so far away from anything that I do, I really didn't even know how I was going to achieve it. So I walked away, I contemplated things, and I came back, I sat down, and I focused on the task. How can I take this and make it something that is my own? So like many other creative designers, I simply went to the internet and pulled up a whole bunch of images, and I just looked at other images that fell in the range of general creative retouching. And I just went through a whole bunch of images until I finally came across an image that actually spoke to me. It was something that I said, okay, this was a studio shot that had some creative elements, and this is the direction that I wanted to go in. And whenever I felt lost, I kept going back to this other image that helped ground me into the direction that I wanted to go into. So what I did at this point was I took all of these individual layers, I used a right click, and I converted to a smart object. And it's going to take its time, and it's going to create basically a single layer, but I can do all of my other masking and layer effects on top of that single layer. But if I ever needed to come back into this layer structure that's here and adjust any camera raw changes or adjust any curves or anything along those lines, I could still do that at any later point in time. And that's why I love using smart objects. So once I had combined all those loose layers into a single smart object, this now allowed me to use one layer and work with other layers around it. And the first thing that I really needed to do was to take this background, create a mask around the model, and combine that with the starry background that was requested by the magazine editor. And simply, the early mask was something fairly loose. So it came in pretty tight around the model and then loose around the hair. And this is a more refined version, but you get the general idea. So then I dropped in this galaxy background and adjusted the color and tone as needed in order to make them kind of feel like they belong together. This is one of the key elements in combining different elements into a composite, which is matching the tone as well as the color. So in this case, the tone was that we had brights that matched the face as well as darks that matched the outfit. And generally speaking, I was happy with the way this is going so far. However, what they really wanted was vector elements. They wanted something that was different, something that created interest within the image that was out of the ordinary. And I used Adobe Illustrator in order to create the shape using the pen tool as a vector object. Now, technically, I possibly could have done it in Photoshop, but when it comes to using the pen tool to create something like this, I prefer Adobe Illustrator. It simply has more options and more functionality than Photoshop does. So if I were to actually turn off this mask and turn on the layer, which is just the pixels, you see nothing because there are no pixels. I didn't actually use any pixels. Simply, I created the vector art in Illustrator, I imported it as a path inside of Photoshop, and applied it as a mask, once again, inside of Photoshop. But then, after applying the mask, which again means nothing at this point, I use this layer effects down here to create this part down here, which is made up of an outer glow and a drop shadow. So when I zoom in on the background, what you see here is simply made up of vector effects. So what that effectively means is it's not really even pixels. It's just simply some mathematical equation that said add the gradient this way and add the gradient that way and exclude these particular areas. So to me, whenever I work on my images, if I can work non-destructively, then that's definitely the way that I want to go. In general, I had reached something like this, and I realized that this file was getting pretty large. And I really didn't want to keep adding layers because every time I went to save this image, it took, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes a piece. And it became a problem where I would tell it to save, I would keep working, but it was continuing to save and it was slowing down the system, is basically what my problem was. So I had to come up with a way to correct it. Now here's where it's interesting because Adobe had actually, in a fairly recent version of Photoshop, come up with a way around this problem. But here's the thing, if you right click on this file and go down to convert to linked, and what it actually does is it's going to save this smart object right here with all those sub layers from the beginning of this video. It's going to save it out as a separate file. So if you think about it, all it's doing is taking what is effectively this embedded information, making a large file. In this case, it was about 1.5 gigabytes. It's going to save that out as a separate file of 105 gigabytes, but it doesn't have to keep resaving that information because it already saved it once. Now, all it's saving is this information and a link to this information, which is all but nothing because of a single mask. So in my teaching, I understand that most students don't actually understand the usage of smart objects, much less a linked smart object. I totally get that. But all I'm saying is somewhere along the line, Adobe is moving forward to create these abilities for us that we don't even realize that we need yet. And once you have a need for it and then you discover that you can do it, that's where things become amazing. Okay, so I take these 3 layers and I put them into a folder called back, and then I leave this as the base background of the image that I'm going to build on top of. Now, one of the early things that they had requested from me were the vector shapes that actually created this right here. And I really didn't like this because it took me away from what I normally do. So I had put in an entire mountain range in the background and let it go off into the distance. And I left that for the entire time I worked on the image. But by the time I finished, I didn't actually use that, so I don't have that artwork anymore, but that's actually what I had done. So other than the mountain range that isn't actually here anymore, one of the early things I knew I needed to do was to create some glow effects. I needed to separate the model from the background and otherwise create something that was happening that melded her to the background. And the way that I had done that initially was through some glowing. So if I open up this group of layers, you'll find that I started adding some general special effects. In this layer, I added some random glowing, and then I refined the glowing, and I refined the glowing, and I refined the glowing. So basically, I added all these different layers and effects and things happening, and it was very intentional to create certain blowout areas around the elements in the background that would allow the dark areas to come forward within the model. As I was creating these lighting effects, it's pretty obvious for you to see that we have overlapped into the model and certain areas are blown out. So I needed a secondary model layer to put over the top in order to mask that out. And that's what this layer is for. And I'm going to hide this mask and I'm going to turn on the model again. And here she is at 100%, but she was actually, when I worked on it, about 94%, so that some of the lighting came through anyway. And when I apply this, you can see that what used to look strange now looks perfectly fine because these starbursts and other misty fields were happening behind the model. And that's why I created this secondary layer on top. Now, the reason, again, that I had created it at 94% allowed some of this brighter area to shine through within her upper body. Now, somewhere in here, I was getting very happy with the way this image was working because I really wasn't sure through the entire time of what was actually going to happen. So somewhere around here, I created this disk glow, which simply gave it some boundaries. And in this case, it created a round frame around the model, which helped bring your eye into the focal areas within here. Because basically without it, your eye wanders all off into the different areas of the image. When I turn this on, it keeps you focused into the middle and doesn't let you wander too much. So this is a very strong graphical element for me. So when I finished all of this artwork with the mountain range in the background, I was very happy with what I had and I was good to go. The problem was this, that they had wanted some other elements involved. As I show you here, they had wanted much more vector artwork. And that really meant that I needed to take away this mountain range and put in what was effectively vector artwork. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. But in the end, I actually did. And here's what it looks like when I turn on the layers and I used the same special effects that I created for this disk background. Basically, it's the same. I have the same blue glow that I used inside of the vector shapes and the same glow on the outside that happens. And somewhere around here, it kind of meshed. And I really didn't think it would, but it does. And so that's pretty awesome. So somewhere around here, I was generally happy with the image. I had the core things that they wanted, which was the vector artwork mixed in with the standard retouching. But I think the problem was that they wanted this paint spatter, and I couldn't do paint spatter over a nice clean piece of vector artwork. I took this texture and I liked it, but I started manipulating it a little bit. I didn't want all of it. I just wanted pieces of it to make it feel a little bit more like a painting and less like vector artwork. So if I turn off this mask here, you can see that basically I limited it to the lower half of the body. And somewhere around here going down, it just kind of added this effect. If I turn this back to the way that I ended up with, it's actually a very subtle effect. I used difference as the blend mode and opacity at 15%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you actually zoom in on the image, you can see that it really starts adding this painterly texture to the image that it was actually desperately craving for, because with these harsh edges of the vector art, it really wasn't meshing very well, and this texture really helped it out. And speaking of helping it out, I used a curve with a mask to create this darker area at the bottom, as well as this curve to lighten up the bright points of the image. And then I used this layer right here to shift the colors in the direction that I wanted them to go. So after I had reached this point, I was actually very happy with the image, but there was actually one more element that it needed that was specifically called out by the editor, which was paint spatter. So I used a curve and a mask that created the paint spatter for me at an opacity of 49%. And when I zoom in down here, you can see that it just kind of spatters paint all over the place. It was nothing more than a simple brush that I applied as a mask to a curve. And the reason I did it as a curve is so that it is non-destructive. This way I can always go back to the curve and adjust it as needed. And I do these type of things like all the time because I would rather work on non-destructive type of elements like curves, levels, selective color, as opposed to things that are physically going to damage the image, which are pixels, and combining all my earlier layers into a single image by using the claw shortcut, which I never ever use because I don't want to damage my image. And so now here's the real walk away from this image, is that despite all the work I've done to this image, it's made up of a curve. It's made up of a curve. It's made up of a curve. It's made up of a smart object, which is ultimately linked out to the raw file. We have a smart object, which links out to other files. We have curves and curves and curves, 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 and curves. You start to get the idea that with my curves, 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 and then we have a gradient map, a curve, and then we finally have some pixel data that can actually be damaged. But it can't be damaged. Why? Because it's inside of a smart object, which is linked out to the original file. And below that, we have more smart objects, which are linked out to the original files. And even though some of these are just internet grabs, simply the benefit here is if I brought in some internet JPEG of whatever size, by making it a smart object, I can then make it big, small, scale it around, and I can do it all I want. And it's not going to damage the original image. The big takeaways from this video are this. The client gave me a very specific task, and I took that and I gave them specifically what they asked for. Once I was able to do that, there were no more changes or corrections that I needed to do. I simply sent in the final files and we were done. Another important thing is that I worked off of non-destructive adjustment layers or non-destructive smart objects, because throughout this entire process, it really allowed me to back up and do things over and over and over again and really fine tune what I wanted this image to look like, and finally come up with something that I was happy with. So if you enjoyed watching this video, please go to www.theartofretouching.com where you can find more tips and tricks to make you a better photo retoucher.